All right. Subject is not suicidal. He just wanted. 1500.
You know, Detroit 4 trying to raise you.
Board. I'm sorry. 37 in Coronado. Not bad. There's probably a little bit more to it. It sounds like it's a friend that knows
8:30, 8:45 in the morning.
Thinking they probably couldn't come here at the table.
The board officer.
Either way, I mean, there's some very, very minor injuries with the struggle of the beer.
Ma'am, can you call Miss Irene Trevino? Because I'm here past 5 minutes and nobody's come out. After he left from work, he discovered the damage about 8 o'clock, 8:20 in the morning on Friday.
Whatever's on the board will just go to your screen.
Owner nosy, he's got permission to be there. I'll be clear.
13, Cross Street, Saratoga. For Medic 6, Medic 6 for the call. As a patient has fell down, lost consciousness. I'll go ahead and start you an engine. Work off EMS 1 at 841.
Medic 6, copy.
Yep. Call 64 to Weber, apartment number Victor 13.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, we're here to put forward a resolution and ask for unanimous consent for its adoption. This is Flight Coon's resolution, which Senator Coons will speak first on, and then I'll take it from there.
Fell down, was knocked unconscious.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today with my
Senator from Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today with my colleague, Senator Flake of Arizona, to send a strong and clear and, importantly, a bipartisan message to the American people, which is that we stand with the men and women of the Department of Justice, the men and women of the U.S. intelligence community. We support the ongoing investigation into Russian interference in our elections, and we must act, and act unequivocally, to hold Russia accountable for its actions. Mr. President, just 3 days after the U.S. intelligence community issued a detailed and staggering finding that led to an indictment against 12 Russian military intelligence officers for interfering in our 2016 election, President Trump stood shoulder to shoulder with President Putin and failed to challenge Putin's claim that his government played no role in the effort to undermine our democracy. In fact, when asked at the time whether he believed Putin's denial or the U.S. intelligence community, President Trump said, "I have confidence in both parties." Now, he has subsequently walked back those comments. But I think it's important that the Senate be on the record saying that our intelligence community is clear, our law enforcement community is clear, and today the U.S. Senate should be clear. So today, Senator Flake and I are putting forward a resolution that in its language commends the Department of Justice for its ongoing investigation into Russia's interference in our last election, the one that led to last week's 11-count indictment, offering the most thorough and detailed accounting to date of Russia's complex effort to sow doubt and create chaos in the months leading up to our last election. The resolution also reaffirms the intelligence community's assessment of Russian interference and asserts Russia must be held to account for its actions. This can be accomplished in part by immediately and responsibly implementing sanctions provided for in the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, which this body passed 98-2 last summer. Finally, following the President's summit with Putin in Helsinki, today's resolution calls for prompt hearings and the release of notes to better understand what the two leaders discussed and may have agreed to during their one-on-one meeting that ran for 2 hours. I am encouraged by hearings that have already been scheduled, but I think it is important that it be clear that our Senate seeks a role in engagement and oversight. Congress and the American people deserve to know what promises or concessions may have been made to President Putin, and thorough hearings with senior administration officials, including Secretary Pompeo, are critical. Mr. President, this resolution is a first step, a good first step, But we need to be clear on it. President Putin of Russia will not stop until we stop him. We know we face continued threats to our elections in 2018 and beyond. Just last week, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates, our former colleague here in the Senate, cautioned that the warning lights are blinking red again on cyber attacks against our nation. And he said, and I quote, "These actions are persistent, they're pervasive, and they are meant to undermine America's democracy. Attacks on our country's digital infrastructure," he said, "is made principally by Russia." He said, and I quote, "Russia is the most aggressive foreign actor and the worst offender." So we know that we continue to face hostile threats. FBI Director Chris Wray said just yesterday, Russia is still working to sow division in the United States and continues to engage in malign actions against our country. So we need to join arms and look forward to protecting our next election. Today's resolution is an important first step, but I think we should work together to take up and pass the Deter Act, introduced by Senators Rubio and Van Hollen, to deter Russia from interfering in our next elections. I think we should take up and consider the Langford-Klobuchar Secure Elections Act to strengthen election cybersecurity. And of course, I'd like to see my Special Counsel Independence Act taken up and voted on as well. We could build on the $380 million invested in election security, grants provided by this Congress to states back in March to help bolster their election systems against threats. It's important to remember Putin and Putin's Russia are attacking other democratic processes throughout Europe. And as Americans, as senators, we need to stand up and fight for our democracy and the rule of law. I had a memorable conversation with a Ukrainian leader last year who said to me, "If you don't defend your own elections, your own democracy, how can the rest of us count on you to defend ours?" This resolution makes clear that on a bipartisan basis, we intend to defend our democracy. Mr. President, Russia's attacks on our last elections were attacks on every American, Republican and Democrat. The threat is grave, it is pressing, and it demands that we act. Today's resolution is a first step and an important one, and I call on my colleagues to join us in supporting it. If there is any senator who disagrees with this very basic resolution, I look forward to hearing for their reasons. And Mr. President, let me close by thanking my colleague and friend, Senator Flake from Arizona, for having taken the initiative and the lead in introducing this important resolution. We may not agree on everything, but we agree on this important principle. We should stand and be counted in defense of our democracy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I thank the Senator from Delaware, Senator Coons, for helping get together and working on this resolution and for working it through his caucus. I hope that we can pass it today. There may be an objection to moving forward. If there is, we'll bring it back again and again. This needs to be passed. The Senate needs to speak here. Mr. President, in his dystopian novel, 1984, George Orwell wrote, quote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their most final, essential command," unquote.
Sir, I'll be working off duty 40.
Well, we saw earlier this week in Helsinki what was truly an Orwellian moment. What we saw earlier this week in Helsinki is what happens when you wage war on objective reality for nearly 2 solid years, calling real things fake and fake things real, as if conditioning others to embrace the same confusion. Ultimately, you're rendered unable to tell the difference between the two, and are at critical times seemingly rendered incapable of thinking clearly. Your mind a hash of conspiracy theory and fragments of old talking points, deployed in response to a question no one even asked. Ultimately, you fail to summon reality in the face of a despot in defense of your country. It wasn't a hard question, Mr. President. An American president was invited by a reporter to denounce the Russian attacks on our elections, and in doing so, to defend the country that he was elected to lead. This should have been not much of a test at all for any American president, and yet it was, and our president failed that test. The findings of our intelligence community regarding the Russian aggression are not matters of opinion, no matter how powerful and strong Putin's denial. To reject these findings and to reject the excruciating specific indictment against the 12 named Russian operatives in deference to the word of a KGB apparatchik is an act of will on the part of the President. And that choice now leaves us contemplating the dark mystery. Why did he do that? What would compel our President to do such a thing? Those are questions that urgently beg for an answer. And it is our job to find that answer.
214-952.
But what isn't a mystery is that by choosing to reject object reality in Helsinki, the President let down the free world by giving aid and comfort to an enemy of democracy. In so doing, he dimmed the light of freedom ever so slightly in our own country. Such is the power that we vest in the presidency. Such are the consequences when a president does not use that power well. I can add no further to the extraordinary and thoroughly justified response of my fellow Americans from across the political spectrum to the events in Helsinki, ranging from heartbreak to horror. But I will say that if ever there was a moment to think not of just your party, but for the country, this is it. This is not a moment for spin, deflection, justification, circling the wagons, forgetting, moving on to the next news cycle, or for more of Orwell's doublespeak. No, when the American government offers an onslaught on unreality, it puts the whole world at risk. That is the lesson of Helsinki. That is the dose of reality that hit hard. We have indulged myths and fabrications, pretended that it wasn't so bad, and our indulgence got us the capitulation in Helsinki. We in the Senate who have been elected to represent our constituents cannot be enablers of falsehoods. This bipartisan resolution from the Senator from Delaware and I that we have here today commends the Department of Justice for its thorough investigation that has led to the indictment of 12 Russian operatives who, on behalf of the Russian government, interfered in the 2016 election. It acknowledges that such efforts by the Russian government to undermine our elections, as confirmed by our own Director of National Intelligence, continue. Specifically, the Flake-Coons resolution rejects the denial of election interference by Russian President Vladimir Putin, something that our President failed to do when given the opportunity in a public forum in Helsinki on Monday. This resolution calls for the full and immediate implementation of mandatory sanctions passed by a vote of 98-2 to deter and punish election interference by the Russian government. If there are waivers that are needed, and there are some needed, for the Indian government, for example, for weapons they purchased from the Russian government or hardware, there is a waiver process already in law for that, and I would support that. Finally, the resolution calls on the relevant committees of the Senate to exercise oversight, including prompt hearings and obtaining relevant notes and information to understand what commitments were made by the President at the summit and the impact it will have on our foreign policy going forward. The Russian ambassador last night said that, quote, important verbal agreements were made. Mr. President, we need to know the details of those agreements. Mr. President, empirical, objective truth has taken a beating for the last 18 months. I said from this pulpit in January that the dissemination of untruths has the effect of eroding trust in our vital institutions and conditioning the public to no longer trust them. As we saw in Helsinki on Monday, entertaining the untruths of a dictator has the same effect. Passing this resolution will let our constituents, the administration, our allies, and our adversaries know that here in the Senate, we do not entertain the deceit of dictators. The truth is, Russia interfered in our elections in 2016, and these efforts continue. Accepting that truth is the first step in preparing us to confront this malign activity. Let's pass this resolution. Mr. President, I ask for unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 583 submitted earlier today. I ask for unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
No, that was
Let me
the
first
request.
thank
There's no
the
address for that.
Senator from Arizona and the Senator from Delaware for expressing all of our concern about Russian interference in the 2016 election. It's absolutely clear they did, and the President has said as much on a number of occasions. Now, I agree, in Helsinki, he was less than clear about that, but he came back and said that he misspoke and reaffirmed his earlier position that, yes, the Russian government had attempted to interfere in the election, although nobody disputes the fact that they were unsuccessful in changing a single vote or affecting the outcome. Ironically, the very same investigation, which has made clear that the Russians did attempt to disrupt the election, has also made clear there is no evidence of collusion that anybody has uncovered to date. So my concern is with this resolution is that it is purely a symbolic act, and what we need to do is not just offer symbolic resolutions on the floor. We need to do the hard work that senators have to do through the regular order. In other words, our committees that have jurisdiction over these issues ought to be permitted to call the witnesses and ask the hard questions and develop the record before we go on record as to a resolution like this. I would point out that the indictments that were referred to, apparently, according to published reports, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, asked the President before Helsinki should he withhold announcement of those indictments or go ahead before the summit. And the President said, no, go ahead. Well, anybody who's read the 29 pages of the indictment issued at the request of Robert Mueller by a grand jury here in the District of Columbia knows there is chapter and verse of how Russians attempted to interfere with the election. It's a good and important read. But the President knew that before he went to Helsinki, so to me, it gives me some confidence that he did indeed misspeak, especially in light of his subsequent affirmations of Russian interference in the election. I happen to be privileged to sit on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. We have been conducting bipartisan investigation of the Russian matter for the entire time that the President has been in office, for the last year and a half. We've already issued some preliminary reports. That's the way to do our work, is through bipartisan committee work, have the witnesses come and testify, ask them hard questions, and render our judgment. I know that Secretary Pompeo is coming before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee sometime next week. He ought to be asked hard questions, and I'm confident he will respond to those questions. But that's how we get the information we need. Let me just say that I think we should consider sanctions, not sort of sense of the Senate resolutions that have no sting or no impact, certainly no deterrent effect on what we all want to discourage, which is Russian involvement in our 2018 elections. And that's why the Majority Leader today asked the Chairman of the Banking and Foreign Relations Committee to hold hearings and recommend additional measures that could respond or deter Russian malign behavior. That's the way we ought to do our work, through our committees of jurisdiction, because you know what? When we rush to judgment and we try to do resolutions like this, we can inadvertently make mistakes. And let me point out one that's in this resolution. There's a reference to the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which passed the Senate 98-2 to deter and punish election interference by the Russian Federation. There is a provision in the current conference committee on the Defense Authorization Committee that would issue a waiver of that act to our partner, India. Now, if we want to encourage countries like India to come into to partner with the United States of America, the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy, then we ought to be all about encouraging that movement toward us and away from the Russian Federation.
And I worry there's no reference in here to the waiver provision in the Defense Authorization Conference Committee that India has asked for and that Secretary Mattis has requested that Congress grant. So all I'm asking for is a little bit of caution here that in the rush to issue a resolution, we, number one, I don't think acknowledge the full picture, but we also don't commit our work to the committees that have jurisdiction over these matters to do it carefully and thoughtfully in a bipartisan way so we come up with the best solution to the problem. So, Madam President, I just think this is the wrong way to go about it. I think our committees ought to continue to do their work. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Defense, Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and the Banking Committee, and we ought to come up with the right kind of bipartisan answer, which I think could well be increased sanctions against the Russian Federation to deter them from meddling in our 2018 elections and beyond, because I'm confident they will continue until we stop them from doing so. Madam President, I would object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The Senator from Arizona.
I think it's regrettable that this is objected to. We will bring it back. The Majority Leader said that this is just a symbolic vote. It is. And symbolism is important. Obviously, we have underlying sanctions that we ought to fully implement. If there are waivers that are needed, there's a waiver process already in the NDAA authorization. And I support those waivers with regard to India. This does not affect that. This simply says, in a symbolic way, that we in the Senate don't buy Vladimir Putin's rejection or his denial of election interference. That was put in question this week, whether our government believes that or not. We here in the Senate should stand and say, we don't believe it. We know the intelligence is right. We stand behind our intelligence community. We need to say that in the Senate. Yes, it's symbolic, and symbolism is important. Our agencies of government need to know that we stand behind them. That's what this is about. So I hope that we will pass this. I note regretfully that there's been an objection to it, but we'll bring it back. I believe that this should pass, and I believe it ultimately will pass. And with that, I yield back.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the post-closure time on the Bounds nomination expire at 1:45 p.m. today. Further, that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that following disposition of the Bounds nomination, the Senate resume legislative session and proceed to the immediate consideration of a Schumer resolution that is at the desk. Further, that the Senate immediately vote on the resolution that it agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection. The Senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I just wanted to join my colleague from Arizona in briefly remarking on my regret that our resolution was not adopted today. It does call for the full implementation of mandatory sanctions provided for in CATSA, as discussed at some length. But it does not call for the reckless implementation of mandatory sanctions. There are a significant range of sanctions already provided for in this law, adopted by 98-2 by this body, that have not yet been adopted. I recognize that this resolution, standing strong behind the Department of Justice, the intelligence community, and its ongoing investigation is, as was referenced, a symbolic act. But there are moments when symbolism and standing together are important. And I look forward to continuing to work closely with my colleague and friend from Arizona to ensure that this resolution is adopted, that the American people and the men and women of our federal law enforcement agencies and our intelligence community understand that this body strongly supports them and their work and sees clearly the ongoing and continuing threat to our democracy posed by President Putin and Putin's Russia. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Democratic Leader.
First, before I talk about the resolution that Senators Menendez, Schatz, and myself will be voted, that we have authored, that will be voted on at 1:45. I'd like to say a few words about the work of my friends from Delaware and Arizona, and my severe disappointment that there was objection from the Republican leadership. The bottom line is very simple. President Trump has put our country in a foreign policy crisis. President Trump has weakened the security of this country. A resolution is the minimum we can do. The minimum. We should be acting. And the idea that we cannot even pass a resolution in this body because of the objection of the other side, when this was done in a bipartisan, careful way by the senators from Arizona and Delaware, shows something very bad. That our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so cowed by a president that they cannot stand up for national security. They cannot stand up to Vladimir Putin, just as the president seems not to be able to. And I'd say one more point. From what I am told, one of the major objections from the other side was the including of contemporaneous notes, that Congress wished that contemporaneous notes in that secret meeting for 2 hours be made available. That is key. What are they hiding? What are they afraid of? Don't the American people have a right to know what went on in that meeting, particularly when President Putin gets up and talks about some agreements that it seems not even our high-ranking officials in the state, defense, intelligence departments know about? This is amazing. We have come to a really low moment in this body when a bipartisan resolution that is rather modest, that was limited. I had talked to my friend from Delaware. He knows I want much more in this resolution. But in effort to get something done, we limited it. My view, the view of most Americans, the notes should be made available. The translator should be made available. The translator wasn't specifically referred to in this resolution, but when they talked about relevant people coming, my view, and I believe the view of the senator from Delaware, was that that would include the translator. I'm not sure if it was the view of my friend from Arizona, but it doesn't matter. We're not even passing this resolution. I have to say, this was a moment for bipartisanship. This was a moment for America pulling together. This was a moment when the president doesn't serve the country well, that Americans of all parties, all ideologies come together and fill that void and undo the misdeeds that occurred in Helsinki. Unfortunately, because of weakness, fear, my guess is if you looked inside the hearts and minds of every member on the other side, all but maybe one or two would feel this is the right resolution. But they're afraid. Fear will not get us anywhere. Letting a bully push us around, meaning President Putin, as he pushed President Trump around, will not serve this country well. It's a sad moment that this resolution was rejected. Now, before I yield to my good friend, the hardworking and very, very able head of the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I just want to talk on our resolution, which we are going to get a vote on. Lord knows if we couldn't have even gotten a vote on that. The idea that an American ambassador who served us so well should be brought before Putin and his minions to be questioned when there is no charge against him, no issue against him. It's not like the 12 Russians who were indicted for trying to interfere with our elections. There's not even an analogy. There's not even an evenness. And President Trump amazingly called this an incredible offer. Our president is saying that one of our ambassadors to be hauled before an authoritarian regime that twists the truth, that lies at will, that even seems to kill people they want to, poison in other countries. And that's an incredible offer. Well, this resolution is a fine resolution. It'll pass. It doesn't undo what just happened. It doesn't make up for the fact that our colleagues are afraid to take real action, and even a resolution that posits action in terms of the major misdeeds at Helsinki. But at the very least, we're protecting the integrity of men and women who serve us. Because if today it's the ambassador, tomorrow it could be somebody in the military, or somebody in the intelligence agencies, or elsewhere. So this resolution is very clear. What it says, what it says is that President Trump called Putin's offer an incredible offer, he was incredibly wrong. No president can put one of our fine servants who've worked hard, in this case, for the diplomatic corps at risk. And this resolution, a bare minimum of what we should be doing here. I'm glad it will be on the floor, and I suspect it will pass, hopefully unanimously. I yield the floor to my colleague from New Jersey.
She's going to be having a provider assist going on
Madam
board with
President.
her too.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I'm very pleased to join with the distinguished Democratic leader in co-authoring this resolution. Before I speak to it, I do want to speak to the Flake-Coons resolution. I certainly would have supported it, although I believe it's the minimum of what this body should be expressing after what we saw in Helsinki. This is a moment for bipartisanship and for patriotism, because what I saw in Helsinki speaks to the opposite of standing up to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I find it interesting in the majority whip's objection to the resolution coming to a vote, that among other things, he's talking about we should have more sanctions against Russia, which I will speak to shortly. We are in the midst of developing a new strong package of sanctions as it relates to Russia. So I embrace and welcome him to that effort if he seeks to actually see real sanctions against Russia. But, you know, we have sanctions. There are sanctions that passed 98-2 in this institution, passed overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives, forced the president to sign it as a result of overwhelming votes, and yet have not been fulfilled. Sanctions that were largely mandatory but have not been fulfilled. So we could start off by having a robust engagement of the existing sanctions, and I'm not quite sure how we start being tough on Russia. One of the elements of those sanctions was to go after Russia's defense sales of defense weapons, and here we are, we're already looking for waivers. So there's a difference between a country that maybe has a long history of buying Russian military equipment, but the S-400, a new anti-defense system, that's a new version. That's not a legacy issue. So I'm not sure how we're going to tell one country you can buy the S-400, but another country you can't. It doesn't work. That's how sanctions begin to crumble at the end of the day. But I welcome the response that we should be having new sanctions. Now, as it relates to this resolution, it's outrageous that the White House would not instantaneously and firmly dismiss a proposition that Russian prosecutors would come question a former United States ambassador. Again and again, we have seen President Trump take Vladimir Putin's word. And it's unconscionable that this White House would give anything other than a full-throated defense of America's foreign service, like Ambassador Mike McFaul, who served our country with honor and distinction. The reason that Putin doesn't like Mike McFaul is because as our U.S. ambassador, he stood up for democracy, human rights in Russia. He stood up to the Russian regime. He promoted American values and ideals. He spoke truth to power inside of Russia. That's why Putin wants him. Congress shouldn't have to tell America's president to stand up for America's public servants and its diplomatic corps, but apparently we have to. President Trump has repeatedly dismissed Russia's attack in 2016, and he shrugs off the threat it poses today despite all of its intelligence agencies and the Director of National Intelligence just days ago saying there are red blinking lights about Russia's continual engagement and interference in the elections that will take place 110 days from now. This week, he continuously and directly contradicted his own national security advisors and instead embraced the line of Putin and Russian intelligence. Now, I know they've been trying to clean it up, but he said it so many times the same way he said it in Helsinki. That's what he really believes. That's what he really believes. And now to say something different, wrong time, wrong continent, not too much. He spouted talking points that sound like they're straight from the Kremlin. He's shown a willingness to accede to Putin's request to interrogate Americans, a willingness to accept Putin's denials about Russian interference, a willingness to attack NATO allies like Montenegro, and a willingness to be a supplicant to Putin's views. The president keeps claiming he's been tough on Russia. No, it's Congress that has been tough on Russia by passing the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act with broad and deep bipartisan support. The White House hasn't taken it seriously. They've ignored a series of mandates in the law. The clear tone and intent coming from the Helsinki summit was one of accommodation, not of pressure. Madam President, I don't see any other way forward other than further congressional action to forcefully call out and address the administration's willful paralysis to Putin's abhorrent behavior. Our efforts to date have been transformative, but just as the administration has been prepared to find ways that allow them to circumvent the law and avoid implementing mandatory provisions of CATSA, we must be equally prepared to adjust and adapt by closing those loopholes. That's why I will soon introduce comprehensive legislation to increase pressure to actually implement the law and increase pressure on Russia for its aggression against the United States and our allies. Among the considerations we have for this new legislation will be to increase sanctions on Russia's energy sector, to increase sanctions on its cyber sector, to increase pressure on Russia's oligarchs and those who are closest to Putin, and to look at Russia's sovereign debt as a target. We cannot wait to see whether Russia attacks us in the 2018 election. We know that they are in the midst of making that a reality, and we need to ramp up the pressure. We can't afford to wait. And based on this president's behavior, we also need to protect our institutions here at home. That's why we want to include protections for the Office of the Special Counsel. The president has done more to target Bob Mueller than he has to go after Vladimir Putin. And this must stop. This effort must be bipartisan, which is why I look forward to working with Republican colleagues who truly want to see us fight back on Russia, nearly all of whom voted to increase sanctions on Russia last year and place more authority for sanctions alleviation in the hands of Congress. They were right to support such measures in July of 2017, and God knows they would be right now to step up and defend America's interests. It's time to show the American people that we can be patriots, not just partisans. It's time to show the world that we can put our country over party. And it's time that we defend America's democratic institutions against Russia's continued aggression. I look forward to the resolution and its vote and urge everyone to join us in approving it. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of the clerk.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. The Guardian, South Staples, and Saratoga. CDC wanted to go mail.
shirt, blue jeans, is carrying a pistol, has tattoos, possibly eastbound Saratoga by the Luby. Calls working on Patrol 3, 1045.
About 180 in line.
180.
Can you check the history on this address and apartment number, please? We made a call over here earlier.
10-4. Did you just want me to check today or how far back?
Maybe about 2-3 weeks back.
Stay by.
2-4. Sure.
Yeah, the black shirt walking in front of Taco Bell. 10-4. Yes, copy.
Saratoga and Patty.
Patty. You're on mobile. You said an accident?
Delta 160. Is TRU close? Because I believe she just needs to add information to the report.
No, they're closed today. They're closed on the weekend.
They're closed on weekends. Okay, 10-4.
Senator from Iowa.
Chevy Tahoe, tan and color involved.
Without objection.
And no
Today we will vote on the confirmation of Ryan Bounds to the Ninth Circuit. He is nominated to fill the vacancy left by Judge O'Scanlan. Mr. Bounds once served as a law clerk to that Ninth Circuit Judge O'Scanlan. Mr. Bounds is highly qualified to serve on the Ninth Circuit. A native of Oregon, he attended Stanford University and Yale Law School. He has dedicated his career to public service, serving in government for the past 14 years. The last 8 years were as Assistant U.S. Attorney in Oregon. I've listened to my colleagues on the other side voice their opposition to Mr. Bounds. Interestingly, none of them cite anything Mr. Bounds has done in his legal career as a reason for opposing his nomination. Instead, they focus on two things. First, they say we shouldn't confirm Mr. Bounds because his home state senators didn't return their blue slips. Second, they say some of Mr. Bounds' college writings were insensitive. So I'm going to start on point number one, that they base their opposition to him. As I've explained so many times on the floor of the United States Senate and in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I don't know how many times to the multitudes of journalists that are on the Hill, my blue slip policy is the same as all but 2 of the 18 predecessors, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, over the 100-year history of blue slips. Like Chairman Ted Kennedy, Joe Biden, and Orrin Hatch, I will hold hearings for circuit court nominees with negative or unreported blue slips if the White House consulted with home state senators. And I won't allow senators to abuse the blue slip courtesy for political or ideological reasons. In the case of Mr. Bounds, the White House sought the Oregon senators' input, seriously considered the one candidate suggested by the Oregon senators, and waited several months for the senators from Oregon to establish their Judicial Selection Committee, which is quite a tradition in that state. The Selection Committee itself even recommended Mr. Bounds, yet the Oregon senators still didn't return their blue slips. They say it was because Mr. Bounds didn't disclose some of his college writings to the Selection Committee.
He lives out of town?
There's a very good reason he didn't. The Selection Committee never asked for his college writings. In fact, Senator Wyden's staff instructed Mr. Bounds not to disclose them. Moreover, the Oregon senators refused to ever meet with Mr. Bounds during this whole process. It's been misleadingly said this will be the first time in modern history we confirm a judge without at least one positive blue slip from the two state senators. Well, my Democrat colleagues have only themselves to blame. The way the blue slip used to be enforced was through the 60-vote filibuster. And that was done away with, you know, November 2013. By then, the Democrat majority, and Senator Reid leading them. For example, Chairman Hatch held hearings for 5 nominees in 2003 and 2004, despite the lack of positive blue slip from either home state senator. These nominees were voted out of committee. Then Senate Democrats blocked these nominees on the floor by using the 60-vote filibuster. But my colleagues, Democrat colleagues, abolished that filibuster, as I said, in 2013, for the reason that they needed the votes and the freedom to pack the D.C. circuit with liberal judges who would uphold Obama's regulatory scheme. Leading this effort was none other than Senator Merkley of Oregon, who argued that 41 senators shouldn't be able to block a Senate majority from confirming judges. Now they have a different point of view. Now he argues that he alone should have the right to block Mr. Bounds from even getting a hearing in Judiciary Committee. In November 2013, I told my Democratic colleagues that they would regret abolishing the filibuster just to stack the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals with their friends. Now, obviously, today, as they consider the Bounds nomination, they know that they made a mistake. Turning to the only other criticism my colleagues have made about Mr. Bounds, and that's in regard to his college writings, I don't believe that misguided statements made in a college newspaper 25 years ago should disqualify Mr. Bounds. I hope that we don't live in a world where controversial things that we write in college end our careers forever. This is especially true with our kids and grandkids now in the era of social media. For example, a few years ago, just when the same thing came up on Justice Wright going to the Minnesota District Court, I voted and supported her despite very controversial writings she had in law school. We shouldn't assume that views expressed years ago during college and law school represents the nominee today. Mr. Bounds testified that he regretted much of what he wrote in those op-eds. We received numerous letters in support of Mr. Bounds' nomination from people who have known him personally throughout his life. We received a letter from some of his classmates at Stanford. They wrote, and before I quote, it's kind of like, you know, these sound like they were his friends in the dormitories. And I never was a dormitory student, but I imagine you really get acquainted with people there. So this is what they had to say about Mr. Bounds. We have become aware of a handful of controversial op-eds and articles that Ryan wrote for the Stanford Review during that time. None of us believe that these writings reflect Ryan's character, either then or now. All of us remember our dorm mate fondly. We are a diverse bunch, yet Ryan never failed to treat all of us with courtesy, respect,
and civility, regardless of our respective genders, sexual orientation, skin colors, religions, ethnicity, or any other characteristic. There is not and never has been a racist, sexist, homophobic, or bigoted bone in Ryan Brown's body. End of quote. Mr. Bounds has also been a community leader promoting diversity and equality. As a member of the Multnomah Bar Association Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, Mr. Bounds spearheaded programs to expose underprivileged young people to the legal profession. He mentored young scholarship recipients and help those same people navigate law school admission and law school. He expanded low-cost CLE offerings and organized anti-harassment and anti-discrimination training. Mr. Bounds is eminently qualified to serve on the Ninth Circuit. His college writings do not represent who he is today. His professional accomplishments and exemplary public service speak much more loudly to his character and integrity. So, I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support Mr. Bounds' confirmation today. I'd like to say one thing about another nomination issue. I understand that so far, no Senate Democrat has met with Judge Kavanaugh. They are apparently awaiting their marching orders from the minority leader. Well, the American people elected each one of those Democratic senators to represent them, not the minority leader. And when Senate Democrats have largely already made up their minds to vote against Judge Kavanaugh, and none of them have even met with him, their demand for a paper chase beyond relevant material sounds more and more like a demand for a taxpayers-funded fishing expedition. Now, Madam President, I would like to address my colleagues in the United States Senate on the life and death of Governor Bob Ray, wonderful governor for the state of Iowa and over a long period of time, and honor him this way. I want to pay tribute to my good friend and an exceptional Iowan whose life and legacy will be remembered in my home state for generations to come. As the people of Iowa mourn the loss of our 38th governor, I would like to share a few ways how Robert E. Ray made Iowa a better place to grow. Looking back at his lifetime of service, it seems nearly impossible that one person could wear so many hats and reach the highest rungs of distinguished service in both public life and the private sector. After graduating from high school in 1946, Bob enlisted in the U.S. Army to serve his country that way. He returned from service and earned undergraduate and law degrees from Drake University, Des Moines, Iowa. He married the life of his life, Billy, and together they raised 3 daughters. In addition to serving 14 years as our state's chief executive from 1969 to 1983, Governor Ray also served as our state party chairman at the age of 35, chairman of the National Governors Association, interim mayor of Des Moines, 11th president of Drake University, U.S. delegate to the United Nations Conference on Refugees, CEO and board member to a number of nonprofits and for-profit corporations, reading such an outstanding resume, one might come to the conclusion that this Iowan must have an outside eagle to match. To that, I can personally affirm Bob Ray was a humble leader driven by a servant's heart. He brought honesty, dignity, and integrity to the campaign trail and in turn to state government. His policy achievements as 38th governor made government work better for the people, reorganizing state government, like the creation of the Department of Transportation, and modernizing National Guards. And that's just a few of the